Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're very pleased to have you here. These instructions are a little bit different. If you're listening to the live webinar on May 22nd, 2020, and would like to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, be sure to attend the entire 1 hour session. As Sherry mentioned, the handout and all the forms you'll need to complete to obtain CE credit will be emailed to you after the webinar. During shelter in place, we've changed our instructions a little bit because we will accept emailed PDFs of the completed ASHA participant form. So you can either mail the form postmarked no later than 5/29/20 to Darlene Davis, or you can complete your ASHA forms using Adobe Reader and email the forms to Darlene Davis before or on 5/29/2020. Do not mail us an image. Don't take a picture with your camera, please, and send us an image of the form. We can't submit that to ASHA, and that would require our administrator to recopy it, which, given the number of people that have been online on all our webinars, that will be problematic for her to finish within the deadline where she needs to get these forms to ASHA. That takes care of the CE information. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Patricia Ybarra.
Thank you, Nancy, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This session provides speech-language pathologists and other professionals who conduct in-depth language assessments with an overview of CELF Preschool-3. My name is Patricia Ybarra. I am a speech-language pathologist and research director at Pearson Clinical Assessments. The financial relationship to disclose is that I'm employed by Pearson Clinical Assessment, which is the ASHA continuing education provider for this session. There are no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. And Pearson Clinical Assessment is the sponsor of this webinar. The assessment division of Pearson develops and distributes assessments and intervention tools for speech-language pathologists. This webinar covers information that pertains to the effective and appropriate use of the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals preschool 3. No other assessments will be discussed during this presentation. The webinar covers these major topics. I'll describe the features of the new CELF Preschool-3 with the focus on administration and scoring of subtests. And this is followed by a review of the test development and research, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. At the end of this webinar, you'll be able to list at least 2 differences between CELF Preschool-2 and CELF Preschool-3, explain how to obtain and score the connected speech sample using the No Juice book, and list at least 2 subtests that comprise the Academic Language Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index. So we'll start off by answering what is CELF Preschool-3. The CELF Preschool-3 that's going to be published this summer is an individually administered norm reference instrument that can be used to assess the language and communication skills of children ages 3 to 6 years. It is a practical and efficient clinical tool for identifying, diagnosing, and performing follow-up evaluations of language and communication deficits in preschool-age children. The CELF Preschool-3 is a downward extension of the CELF 5 that was published in 2013. The subtest parallels the CELF 5 test to increase the ceiling of the CELF Preschool-3 and facilitate the score consistency at ages 5 and 6 years, which are the ages shared by the 2 tests. The CELF Preschool-3 and the CELF 5 share some test items. So you'll notice that if you're a CELF 5 user. The CELF Preschool-3 can be used to determine if a child has a language impairment. And it can also be used to determine the nature of impairment, so strengths, weaknesses, affected language modalities, if there's a receptive language impairment, an expressive language impairment, or if it's a mixed receptive, expressive language impairment. Also, it's a tool that can be used to collect areas on content areas that are affected or conditions that enable the child to communicate most effectively. Additionally, you can collect information on early classroom and literacy fundamentals, and also communication in context. And what I mean by communication in context is information on pragmatic language skills. To better reflect current and diagnostic and assessment practices in various settings, the CELF Preschool-3 offers a revised assessment process in comparison to the CELF Preschool-2. The revised assessment process continues to give professionals flexibility in selecting and administering only those subtests and checklists that are relevant to the specific objectives of their evaluation. The CELF Preschool-3 features 2 new subtests that can be used independently and are not required to obtain index scores. The Connected Speech Sample subtest was designed to further evaluate language skills in the context of a language sample and increases diagnostic support. The Pragmatic Activities Checklist assesses communication in context. It was designed to assess social language behaviors that may interfere with a child's interactions and performance in various settings. The CELF Preschool-3 offers additional subtests that yield scale scores, allowing professionals to easily compare a child's performance to that of typically developing peers. The new subtests the subtests that now offer scale scores are Phonological Awareness, the Preliteracy Rating Scale, and the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile. CELF Preschool-3 features 2 new index scores, the Academic Language Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index. These scores enhance the test's clinical utility. You can use these scores as additional support to make recommendations for intervention or educational plans. The CELF Preschool-3 subtests included in the CELF Preschool-2 battery were broadened in scope. Easier and more difficult items were added to more adequately cover the range of developmental skills. CELF Preschool-3 has expanded the floor of the test to provide greater diagnostic value for children ages 3 and 4. And also, the ceiling is expanded to provide greater diagnostic value for children ages 5 and 6. Items were modified based on examiner feedback as well. CELF Preschool-3 provides updated norms and digital options on Pearson's Q Interactive and Q Global platforms. The CELF Preschool-3 screening test kit will also be available separately. Compared to the CELF Preschool-2, the CELF Preschool-3 discontinue rules have been reduced or retained to minimize formal testing time. The CELF Preschool-2 stimulus books were reformatted. The CELF Preschool-3 includes 1 stimulus book that contains verbal and visual stimuli and administration directions for each subtest, except for the checklist, which are the Pragmatic Activities Checklist, the Descriptive Pragmatics Profile, and the Preliteracy Rating Scale subtest. Like the CELF Preschool-2, the CELF Preschool-3 includes a no juice book that is used for the Connected Speech Sample subtest. The no juice story has been repurposed as a story retell task for the Connected Speech Sample subtest in CELF Preschool-3, instead of the recalling sentences in context task in CELF Preschool-2, for those of you that are familiar with that one. These are your options for administration and scoring. There's always the print option for administration. It includes the print manual, the stimulus book, and record forms. The scoring options for print administration are manual scoring or scoring on Q Global. The Q Global option includes test administration with a digital manual and stimulus books using any web-enabled computer or tablet and print record forms. So the CELF Preschool-3 manual and the stimulus book are available on Q Global. The CELF Preschool-3 scoring is also available on Q Global, and scores, the test results are presented in an easy-to-understand narrative report that can be downloaded to a word processing program and incorporated into your clinical reports. The CELF Preschool-3 Q Global score reports are a separate component from the CELF Preschool-3 kit. The reports may be purchased individually or as an unlimited subscription annually. The CELF Preschool-3 on Q Interactive is available as well. It's a digital platform that allows the administration and scoring of a test using two digital tablets that work together through a Bluetooth connection. The examiner uses one tablet to give instructions to the child, record and score responses, take notes, and control visual stimuli presentation. And the child uses the other tablet to view and respond to subtest items. CELF Preschool-3 offers 10 norm reference subtests that yield scale scores and 2 supplementary subtests that yield criterion reference scores. The 10 norm reference subtests are pictured here. Okay, and although there are a few changes in the subtest name, so the sentence comprehension on CELF Preschool-3 was sentence structure on CELF Preschool-2, and following directions was concepts and following directions on CELF Preschool-2. Word classes subtest no longer includes the word classes total score, but we'll talk more about that when we look at the word classes subtest individually. And the Phonological Awareness, Descriptive, Pragmatics profile, and Preliteracy rating scale provided age-based criterion scores on CELF Preschool-2, but these subtests now provide scaled scores for CELF Preschool-3. Also, another addition to CELF Preschool-3, you'll notice at the far right, the growth scale values have been added to help measure a child's progress over time. As a diagnostic battery, the CELF Preschool-3 continues to offer a balance of items across receptive and expressive modalities, as well as language content and language structure. Additionally, the CELF Preschool-3 offers more information on early literacy skills and pragmatic skills, and standardized test scores and composite scores meaning the core language score and the index scores, enhance clinical decision-making and descriptions of communication skills and academic language readiness. The 10 norm reference subtests are grouped based on similar assessment measures to yield composite scores. Different combinations of 7 of the 10 subtests yield the core language score, the receptive language index, the expressive language index, the language content index, and the language structure index. 3 of the norm reference subtests yield the academic language readiness index score, and those subtests are the expressive vocabulary and following directions subtests, as well as the descriptive pragmatics profile. And the CELF Preschool-3 also offers the early literacy index, consisting of the phonological awareness subtest and the preliteracy rating scale. Several changes were made to the subtests on CELF Preschool-3. The CELF Preschool-3 subtests included in the CELF Preschool-2 battery were broadened in scope. Easier and more difficult items were added to more adequately cover the range of developmental skills. Administration time for the 3 subtests required to determine the core language score is 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the child's age and responsiveness. The time it takes to administer the remaining subtests varies depending on the child's age, language ability, level of motivation, and the subtest selected. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk about each subtest. The sentence comprehension assesses language structure receptively. For the sentence comprehension subtest, the child identifies a picture that matches the sentence read aloud by the examiner. To present the items, the examiner uses the stimulus book to show the picture stimuli and the record form to document responses. So here's an example of the demo item. The examiner would say, let's look at these pictures. I'm going to point to the picture that shows I can wear this. Now you point to the picture that shows I can eat this. The correct answer is identified in bold color on the record form. The sentence comprehension subtest measures the child's understanding of sentence structures. Item analysis tables like this one provide information on the type of sentence structures with which the child is struggling. From the item analysis table here, you can see a breakdown of the different types of sentence structures assessed, including those with adjectives, prepositional phrases, relative clauses, subordinate clauses. For the word structure subtest, the child completes a sentence using a closed procedure with the target structures. The subtest requires a verbal response. Administration directions were added for the demonstration items between test items in the word structure subtest to improve a child's understanding of the expectations of the task. So here's an example of the subtest items. The examiner would say, I'm going to show you some pictures and say some things about them. I want you to help me by finishing some of the things I say. I'll do the first one. Listen, here is a boy, and here is a girl. The idea is for the examiner to demonstrate the use of the copula as part of the response. This subtest measures expressive use of various morphological structures. The morphological structures assessed include prepositions, possessive, verb tenses, and pronouns, among others. For expressive vocabulary, the child names an object, person, or activity portrayed in a picture. So expressive vocabulary contributes to the new Academic Language Readiness Index, along with following directions and descriptive pragmatics profile subtests. You'll be happy to know that the calculator, telephone, and newspaper were removed. We have updated vocabulary items. An example item is, look at this picture. This is a bird. Look at this picture. What is this? The expressive vocabulary subtest targets words in semantic categories that reflect typical language experiences of children ages 3 to 6. The items measured include verbs and semantic categories like science and math. The CELF Preschool focuses on those connections between language functioning and academic curriculum to bridge the gap and aid in proper educational programming. For following directions, the child points to pictures in response to oral directions. This subtest contributes to the new Academic Language Readiness Index, along with expressive vocabulary and descriptive pragmatics profile subtests. The following directions subtest includes a new task of following directions by pointing to body parts. This developmentally easier concept improves the floor of the subtest, allowing children with emerging skills to participate. Children ages 5 to 6 begin the subtest at a later start point and follow directions by pointing to animals. Additionally, items in the basic concepts and following directions subtest were revised to provide a separate assessment of semantic concepts and following directions. This change allows more precise assessment and analysis of the target concepts in both subtests. So this is a preview of the new task for 3- and 4-year-olds, which is pointing to body parts. 5- and 6-year-olds begin the subtest by pointing to animals. If the child does not correctly point to all of the familiarization items, body parts, or animals, do not administer the corresponding test items on the following directions subtest. The items for following directions are grouped by complexity of directions and type of command. There's temporal commands, conditional commands, or sequential commands. And last, whether or not the direction includes serial orientation. So you can start to see where exactly the child is having difficulty in terms of following directions. For recalling sentences, the child imitates sentences presented by the examiner. So you would say, I'm going to say something to you. I want you to listen carefully and say exactly what I say. Let's try one. Say, the dog is eating. The item analysis provides insight into the kinds of sentence types that the child can produce expressively. Children's linguistic productions and imitative sentence tasks reflect the content and structure of their spontaneous speech. They filter the sentences they hear using their own language system and then repeat the sentence using their own language rules. For basic concepts, the child points to a picture that illustrates the targeted concept presented by the examiner. The basic concept subtest in CELF Preschool-2 provides scale scores for children ages 3 to 4 and criterion scores for children ages 5 to 6. But again, the items in basic concepts and following directions subtests were revised to provide a separate assessment of semantic concepts and following directions. So this change resulted in concepts being added to the basic concept subtest, and now CELF Preschool-3 provides a scale score for children ages 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is an example of the demo item. So the examiner would say, look at these children and point to each picture. Okay, this is a baby. The baby is little. This is a girl, she is big. And this is a boy, he is big too. Look at the children again. I'm going to point to the one who is little. So you would point to the baby and say, the baby is little. Basic concepts assesses different categories of concepts, including directional, positional, attributes, size, concepts such as same and different. For word classes, the child chooses 2 words or pictures that are related from a choice of 3 or 4 words or pictures. The expressive section, where a child explains the relationship between the selected word pair, was dropped from the standardized administration of CELF Preschool-3, and we repurposed the expressive section as an extension testing procedure for exploring a child's strengths and weaknesses. So rather than stopping the administration and asking the child to explain why they chose what they chose, you just continue the administration. Here is the demo item for word classes. So you would say, I'm going to say some words and show you some pictures. 2 of the words go together. Look and listen as I say the words. Bread, shoe, apple. Bread and apple are the 2 words that go together best. An analysis of the child's responses can provide a preliminary description of the semantic class relationships that the child understands. Use the word classes item analysis table to determine error patterns in the child's responses. So what is extension testing? Extension testing is a way to systematically vary subtest content, directions, and the responses required to determine where and when the child's ability to respond correctly begins to break down. You can do extension testing after you have tested and interpreted the CELF preschool results. Consider using extension testing to learn more about the factors that may have contributed to a child's errors. The errors may result from task or format novelty, task complexity, length or complexity of instruction, linguistic content of subtest items, or type of response required. In effect, use extension testing to establish conditions under which the child can perform successfully. Extension testing results allow for making judgments about the degree of difference between the conditions under which the child performs the skills proficiently and his or her performance in real life and academic situations. So in the CELF Preschool-3 manual, we do suggest activities for extension testing for each subtest. And here's an example of a suggested modification for extension testing for the word class subtest. You can use extension testing to further examine the child's comprehension of word relationships by semantic class. Before extension testing, review the items in error and note any pattern of errors by semantic category. You can compare the child's performance on other subtests that examine semantic knowledge, such as the Expressive Vocabulary subtest, Following Directions, and Basic Concepts. A suggested task would be to ask the child to categorize and classify pictures, photos, toys, or other objects by semantic categories, such as fruits, vegetables, etc. Then ask the child to reclassify the pictures by selected characteristics, attributes, or conditions, such as hard, soft, hot, cold. This activity allows the child to demonstrate an understanding of several semantic relationships, as well as mental flexibility and the ability to recategorize. Compare the results of extension testing to the results of formal testing to identify accommodations or modifications that the child may need to be successful in a classroom environment. The Academic Language Readiness Index is a composite score that can be obtained for children ages 3 to 6 and can be derived from the scores of the Expressive Vocabulary, Following Directions, and Descriptive Pragmatics profile subtests. This group of subtests captures semantic and pragmatic language abilities and provides a description of the language and socialization skills needed to meet the language demands of the classroom. This score is not intended to assign a diagnostic category, but it can be used to help make recommendations for the classroom setting and help multidisciplinary teams design appropriate instruction. The Descriptive Pragmatics profile now provides scale scores. It's also available on extra forms in a tear-off pad if you want information from multiple respondents, such as the child's primary caregiver or a teacher. And again, it contributes to the Academic Language Readiness Index score. The Descriptive Pragmatics profile is used to determine if a child demonstrates nonverbal and verbal behaviors that may influence social and academic communication. The behaviors evaluated are common daily skills observed across ages and genders in home and classroom situations that are necessary to express intentions. Skills observed are broken into categories, as you can see in the image: nonverbal communication skills, conversational routines and skills, and asking for, giving, and responding to information. These are samples of the items on the subtest. The Pragmatics Activities Checklist provides a checklist of atypical communication behaviors. The examiner observes the child while taking part in interactive activities and throughout the time with him or her. Each behavior on this checklist is noted as not acquired. Check any behaviors not observed during testing. The behaviors are developmental, so depending on the child's age, a checked item may not necessarily be a concern. Engage the child in 3 activities to complete the checklist. Choose activities from the list of 6 provided in the record form. So these are the activities for the Pragmatics activities checklist. When preparing to engage the child in the activities, note the following. Each activity is designed to take no longer than 5 minutes. And use judgment to determine when and how you engage the child in each activity. One possibility is to begin with 1 or all 3 of the activities to establish rapport with the child before beginning standard testing. Other possibilities include presenting each activity as a break between administrations of other CELF Preschool-3 subtests, or presenting all 3 activities after completing the administration of all the CELF Preschool subtests. Carefully review the checklist before working with the child to identify the behaviors to observe and provide the child with frequent opportunities to demonstrate the behaviors. So you can do this by violating conversational rules or kind of sabotaging your activities to elicit the pragmatic behaviors that you're specifically targeting. These are examples of the items in each of the sections of the Pragmatics activities checklist. You have items that target nonverbal as well as verbal communication behaviors. The Phonological Awareness and the Preliteracy rating scale subtests were designed to provide an organized observation of the child's early literacy skills required by many local education agencies as a measure of school quality or student growth. The Early Literacy Index score can be obtained for children ages 4 to 6. Phonological awareness includes 6 tasks: compound words, syllable blending, sentence segmentation, syllable segmentation, rhyme detection, and rhyme production. And here's an example of an item on the compound word task in phonological awareness. So for the demo item, the examiner will say, I'm going to say 2 words. I'm going to say 2 words. Listen, pan, cake. I can put these 2 words together to make the word pancake. Now you try it. Put these words together. Rain, bow. If the child responds incorrectly, say, the words rain and bow come together to make rainbow. You can present backyard as another trial item if needed. Test items for the pre-literacy rating scale are grouped by early reading skills, and early reading skills such as holding a book right side up or turning the pages, and early writing skills such as drawing or scribbling or writing his or her name. And these contribute to, this score contributes to the Emerging Literacy Index along with the Phonological Awareness subtest. However, the pre-literacy rating scale can be administered. A score can be obtained for children ages 3 to 6. So if you are assessing a 3-year-old, you're not able to get a score from the Emerging Literacy Index, but you are able to collect some information on the child's early literacy skills. So the scale scores are for ages 3 to 6. The other new subtest on CELF Preschool-3 is the Connected Speech Sample subtest. This subtest yields Criterion scores and descriptive information for children ages 3 to 6 years old. You would need to present the No Juice book to the child and read the story in the No Juice book aloud to the child, and then record the child's story retell verbatim in the record form. So we know that oral language abilities are important indicators of future academic success. The objective for this subtest is to assess elements of macrostructure and microstructure in narrative productions. The macrostructure of a story narrative refers to the key components and overall organization of a story. A score for the use of story grammar and qualitative descriptions of story organization and recall are provided as part of the connected speech sample analysis. The microstructure examines the linguistic productivity and complexity at the level of utterances. A table is provided in the record form for professionals to note the use of linguistic structures and compare with the child's performance on the word structure subtest. The CELF Preschool-3 connected speech sample subtest scoring can be used in conjunction with further analysis based on the professional's clinical judgment. So if a language sample is something that you typically do as part of your assessment process, you can use this language sample in particular to conduct your analysis in conjunction with any of the scoring or rating that is provided in the record form. So again, this is a story retell task, and you can rate the child's performance in 4 areas: story organization, their ability to recall facts and details, story grammar, and their use of language structures. Here is the table in the record form for rating story organization and the ability to recall facts and details. So they're broken down by these 3 categories: acceptable, emerging, and beginning. And you can see that there's descriptions, and what you would do is circle the description that most closely aligns with the child's performance on their narrative retell. So for story organization, for example, an acceptable rating would be if the story parts and details are organized with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Emerging would be if the story parts and details are partially organized with either beginning, middle, or end. And then a beginning rating would be if the story parts and details are jumbled and there's no recognizable organization or sequence of events. The story grammar scoring table in the record form can be used to score the following story components: title, setting, characters, main idea, and events in the beginning, the middle, and the end. This is an example of what the story grammar scoring table looks like in the record form. So you would circle each component that the child used in his or her narrative and score each story grammar component according to the point values found in the scoring table, and then sum the score points to compute the raw score for this subtest. Here is the language structures table. Use the language structures table in the record form that includes an adapted list of Brown's grammatical morphemes and other structures to rate the child's level of mastery as acceptable, emerging, or beginning for each structure listed. Acceptable use of a language structure indicates that the child uses the language structure at a mastery level of 90 to 100% accuracy. Emerging use of a language structure indicates the child is in a transitional stage of development and demonstrates at least one correct production. And the beginning use of a language structure indicates the child has not yet developed a skill and is unable to apply the structure in appropriate situations. Here's an example of what that table, that rating table for language structures looks like in the CELF Preschool-3 record form. And of course, we consider dialectal variations when scoring. So responses to the word structure, expressive vocabulary, recalling sentences, and connected speech sample subtests may contain regional and cultural patterns of variations that reflect dialectal differences from standard American English. So if a child's variation is appropriate to the child's language background, you would score it as correct. Selected dialectal patterns are presented in the manual along with examples of responses to items in the word structure subtests that are considered appropriate for dialects other than standard American English. Here are the score charts. These are what the score charts look like in the record form. The raw score for each subtest is adjusted by the child's age to derive a scale score. The scale scores have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3 that are shaded. You can see that range shaded in these tables. And as shown previously, the scale scores for several subtests are combined to yield the core language score and the different index scores. The core language score and index scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. The Criterion scores tables are found here, look like this in the record form. The Connected Speech Sample Subtest and Pragmatics Activities Checklist allow you to evaluate the child's performance based on the specified criteria. Story grammar for Connected Speech Sample is described as acceptable, emerging, or beginning. And for the Pragmatics Activities Checklist, the performance is described as meets criterion or does not meet criterion. Additionally, you can collect qualitative information by filling out the behavioral observation checklist. So you can document information on physical activity level, attention to task, response latency, level of interaction, etc. And this is just an opportunity to have your scores and your qualitative information all in one place. Okay, we're going to discuss the development and research. The CELF Preschool-3 standardization research involved a normative sample of 700 children, and additional samples were collected for reliability and validity studies. The normative sample for each age band included 100 children. These are the age bands. According to the inclusion and exclusion specifications for the normative sample, the children included did not meet the diagnosis criteria for a language impairment, a learning disorder in reading or writing, or a hearing impairment. All children spoke English as their primary language, meaning the language used most often in the home. For the overall normative sample, the average split half reliability coefficients of CELF Preschool-3 subtests range from 0.80 for sentence comprehension to 0.97 for the Preliteracy rating scale. Overall reliabilities for each subtest are good to excellent. The average reliability coefficients are excellent for all composite scores. For the clinical group, children with a language impairment, the subtest reliability coefficients are consistent with the coefficients reported for the normative sample. This initial evidence suggests that CELF Preschool-3 is equally reliable for measuring children's language skills for children from the general population and for children diagnosed with language impairment. The sensitivity and specificity values indicate that the CELF Preschool-3 is a good tool for identifying children with a possible language impairment when used in conjunction with other measures. The cut score of 77 at negative 1.5 standard deviations from the mean results in the best balance between sensitivity and specificity measures. So this is the optimal cut score. Using this cut point resulted in a sensitivity of 0.89 and a specificity of 0.84. The children in this sample who were identified with a language impairment most commonly associated with impaired morphology and syntactic language structures. The corrected correlations for the CELF Preschool-3 and CELF Preschool-2 composite scores are high. The core language score is 0.86. Typically, composite scores are used to make diagnostic and service-related decisions. So a high correlation between composite scores is a good indication that children's classifications would be similar when taking the CELF Preschool-2 and the CELF Preschool-3. And you can see that the norms are pretty similar. The mean values, are pretty similar between both tests. The CELF Preschool-3 was administered to 79 children diagnosed with a language impairment as part of the standardization validity research. The study compares the performance of children identified with a language impairment and that of a matched control. The standard difference is the effect size, which expresses the difference between two scores in SD units. This allows for comparison of discrepancy scores across tests. Effect sizes of 0.50 are considered moderate, and those of 0.80 and above are considered large. So as indicated in the table, the effect size is large for the core language score and the index scores. These results highlight the ability of CELF Preschool-3 to discriminate between children who are developing language typically and those who present with a language impairment. So as a review of the learning outcomes, for number 1, the new subtests include, in CELF Preschool-3, include the connected speech sample and the Pragmatics activities checklist. Also, scale scores are now provided for Phonological Awareness, Descriptive Pragmatics profile, and the Preliteracy rating scale. CELF Preschool-3 also provides the Academic Language Readiness Index score and the Early Literacy Index score. For the learning outcome number 2, explain how to obtain and score the connected speech sample using the No Juice book. The examiner would read the No Juice book aloud to the child and ask the child to retell the story and document the child's retelling. Based on the child's retelling of the story, the examiner can calculate a raw score for story grammar based on components of the story, such as the title, setting, characters, main idea, and events, and also rate the language structures as acceptable, emerging, or beginning. And for number 3, list at least 2 subtests that comprise the Academic Language Readiness Index. Those subtests that comprise the Academic Language Readiness Index are the Expressive Vocabulary subtest, Following Directions, and the Descriptive Pragmatics profile. And then the Early Literacy Index consists of Phonological Awareness and the Preliteracy rating scale. Okay. We do have time for some questions.
Patricia, there was a question about administration time.
Yes. How long does it take to administer this test? Is that the question?
Yes, sorry. Yes, that's it. How long would it take to administer the CELF Preschool-3?
Okay, so the 3 subtests that comprise the core language score, to administer those 3 subtests, it takes between 15 to 20 minutes. Usually the core language score is what professionals look for or need to make a diagnostic decision and to support that diagnostic decision. Now, if the examiner chooses to collect more in-depth information, which is recommended to aid in targeting intervention goals and making recommendations for education plans, the subtests that are selected for administration are going to increase the administration time. But that's it can vary based on the goals of the evaluation and also the age of the child and other factors such as their level of engagement or motivation. So we do know that to administer the subtest for the core language score, it takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay. Someone asked, for the connected speech sample, does the child flip through the book independently or do you flip the pages for them?
So the instructions for the connected speech sample do include the examiner reading through the story, but also flipping the pages and even in addition to flipping through the pages, pointing out the illustrations on each page that go with the part of the story that the examiner is reading out loud. And again, these children are young, preschool age, so they do need that support to kind of guide them through the story retell task. And those instructions are found in the manual as well as in the STEM book.
All right, let me take a look at some others. Oh, there was a question about showing a demo of what the tablet-to-tablet administration looks like. We don't, and I'll just answer that one. We don't have demos of specific tests, but if you go to PearsonAssessments.com/telepractice and go to the, newscast tab, scroll down, and there are some videos showing how some assessments might be administered in either on Q Global or on Q Interactive. Let me keep going. There's quite a few. What is the best way to determine if a 5-year-old kindergarten student should be given the CELF Preschool or the CELF 5?
Well, some background information is definitely useful in making that determination. The CELF Preschool-3 is a very relatively short test in comparison to the CELF 5, meaning that if you look at the subtests that are parallel, there are less items in CELF Preschool-3. The illustrations are a little bit more young child friendly. They're more cartoony and meant to keep young preschool age children more engaged. So the level of attention that a child is able to maintain, their maturity level, questions about their background, have they been assessed before, all those factors can be used to consider which assessment may be more appropriate for the child that you're testing.
Okay, great, thanks. Let me go on. I would say for any information about Q Global and about telepractice, if you go to our website on PearsonAssessments.com/telepractice, there's a lot of information there about how tests are administered. Either there's a demo for Q Interactive and there's a demo for Q Global. Oh, there was a question about why was the test item scale included in the Expressive Vocabulary subtest on CELF Preschool-3?
Can you repeat that one, Nancy?
Sure. They want to know about the test item on the Expressive Vocabulary test for CELF Preschool-3, why the test item scale was included, even though I believe that was also on CELF Preschool-2 as well.
Yeah, we collected good data from that item. It had a good information that provided to be useful for discriminating between children who were typically developing and children who had a language impairment. So that item seemed to be an appropriate fit for the Expressive Vocabulary subtest based on the data that we collected.
There is a few questions about CELF Preschool Spanish. We would like to update the Preschool-2 Spanish that currently exists for CELF Preschool-3, but we haven't started that process yet. It hasn't been a good time in the country to be approaching families to provide a lot of information that we use as part of the demographic information about how long they've been in the country. So we are planning to do that. We continue to remain committed to collecting, to developing Spanish assessments, but it's not going to be ready anytime soon. There's another question about the Expressive Vocabulary question. Can you confirm that the calculator and newspaper were removed and were the calendar and scale pictures updated?
Yes, all the pictures and the Expressive Vocabulary subtests were updated. and the outdated items were removed. And of course, we know that all the items that are included in the Expressive Vocabulary subtest are items that children responded to, that they demonstrated to know based on their performance in the standardization research that was collected. Again, the normative sample included 700 children, and additional children were tested with our clinical group study. And so, yes, the items that were included had updated pictures, and they provided good evidence to support the inclusion of those items in the Expressive Vocabulary subtest.
And I believe they ended up in the middle to more difficult items, but they're not the most difficult items on the subtest, or they go up to age 6, if I remember correctly. There are a lot of questions about CEUs. You'll be receiving the handout that will be full-page slides of this presentation, and the handout includes the slide with the instructions for CEUs. Basically, you'll get the forms along with that handout. You'll complete the forms, either print them out and mail them to Darlene Davis, and the address will be on your handout. Or you can use Adobe Reader to complete the ASHA forms, and you can email those completed ASHA forms that you've completed with Adobe to Darlene Davis. But don't take a picture of your completed form. She won't be able to process that. Connected speech sample, can other stories be used?
Other stories can be used to analyze certain things, such as language structures. However, the scoring that goes with the story grammar component of the No Juice story, that scoring is only applicable to the narrative retells for the No Juice story. But the templated analysis can be used with other language samples. And actually, if you're looking at language structures, and there's a language structure that's in question that was not produced during the story retell task with the No Juice book, it is recommended to, if that's a language structure that you really want information on, then it is recommended to collect further language samples in order to elicit that information that you're specifically looking for.
Someone asked a question about, will this be able to be administered via telepractice? We'll have guidelines. We'll have telepractice guidelines when CELF Preschool-3 is available on Q Global, and we'll post the information about how to do that. As far as being able to show items that a child is pointing to, you have several options, but the most common one is to use a third camera. So there's the camera you have at your site in your computer, the camera at the child's site, and a third camera. Usually it's easiest to use a smartphone camera setup, and there's a video of how you do that called Third Camera Hack on the website. Let me see if we can squeeze in one more at 1 o'clock. So can the Phonological Awareness and Pragmatics Preliteracy rating scale be administered by any professionals other than an SLP? They can be administered by other professionals, but I encourage anyone administering these subtests to look at the user requirements for some guidelines on the background that you should have if you're administering subtests in the CELF Preschool-3. Professionals with a background on the administration of language tests to preschool-age children are preferred, and so yes, I would refer to the user requirements section in the manual for more detailed description of the kinds of professionals that should be or that can administer the CELF Preschool-3 subtest. All right, thank you, Patricia. Sorry, we're out of time. If you need customer support or have additional questions, you can certainly send questions via PearsonAssessments.com. Contact us. or contact your Pearson consultant. Here's the instructions for ASHA CEUs during shelter in place. These instructions will be on the handout that she'll be sending you full slide handouts, full page handouts, so that you'll be able to read this little information. But essentially, you'll be completing the forms she sends you. You can either print them out and complete them and email them to us no later than May 29th. Darlene Davis, and the addresses will be on the handout. Or you can, her email address is there as well. You can complete the form using Adobe Reader and then upload that and email it to Darlene also no later than 5/29. We do not accept forms after that time. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate everyone's questions. We will try to get answers to these questions to individuals that we weren't able to respond to during the session as soon as we can get through them. So have a great rest of your day.